The sun was barely up, casting soft beams of light through the kitchen window as Rachel hummed a quiet tune while flipping pancakes for her children. The smell of sizzling batter filled the house, blending with the faint scent of fresh coffee. Rachel's children, Zoe, age 7, and Ethan, age 5, sat at the table, their chatter a joyful soundtrack to the morning's peace. It was the kind of Saturday morning they'd all come to cherish, simple, warm, and free of stress. There were no rushes to get ready, no deadlines or appointments to worry about, just the soft rhythm of family life, as normal as it could be. "Mom, can I have extra syrup today?" Zoe asked, her face lighting up as she held out her plate. "Of course, sweetie. You're growing, you need your energy," Rachel replied with a smile, pouring the syrup generously over her daughter's pancakes before moving to Ethan's plate. He was already digging into his food, barely pausing to look up, his hands sticky with syrup. Rachel loved these moments. The simplicity of them grounded her, especially after the whirlwind of work and responsibilities that came with being a single mother. Her life had always been a balancing act, but mornings like this made it all worth it. She felt lucky, content, and for once at peace. Her home was a haven, filled with laughter and love. As she carried the last of the pancakes to the table, Zoe and Ethan continued to argue playfully over who could stack their pancakes the highest. Rachel chuckled, wiping her hands on a towel and walking over to the kitchen window. She gazed out at the quiet suburban neighborhood they lived in. Green lawns, neatly trimmed hedges, the occasional car passing by. It was peaceful. It was home. But as Rachel turned to head back to the table, she heard a knock at the door. It was unexpected. No one usually stopped by this early on a Saturday. Her first instinct was to ignore it. But then the knock came again, louder this time, insistent. "Hang on," she muttered to herself, setting down the towel and heading for the door. When she opened it, she was met with a tall woman in a button-up blouse and khakis, holding a clipboard and looking very official. She had a stern expression, her lips pressed tightly together, and her eyes scanning Rachel's face as if assessing the situation. The woman introduced herself as Claire, a social worker from CPS, Child Protective Services. "Good morning, Mrs. Miller," Claire said, her tone polite but with an undercurrent of something more serious. "I'm here to speak with you about a report we've received regarding your household. Do you have a moment?" Rachel blinked, taken aback. "A report," she repeated, her voice edged with confusion. I'm not sure I understand. What report?" The social worker glanced down at the clipboard, then back at Rachel. "An anonymous complaint has been made against your household. The allegation is concerning potential neglect of your children. We're here to investigate the matter further." Rachel felt her stomach tighten. Neglect? The word hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to speak, but Claire continued, her tone softer now, as though trying to reassure her. "The report claims that your children are being neglected and left unsupervised for extended periods. I understand this must be a misunderstanding, but I'm here to confirm the details of the situation." Rachel was speechless. Neglect? Her mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening. The idea that anyone could think she wasn't providing for her children, loving them, caring for them, felt like a cruel joke. And then, like a sudden flash of recognition, she realized. The HOA. Karen, the overbearing HOA president. The woman who had been watching their every move, criticizing the smallest things about their property and lifestyle. Rachel's blood ran cold as she put the pieces together. It had to be Karen who made the complaint. I don't know what to say," Rachel stammered, struggling to keep her composure. "This is a mistake. I'm home with my kids all day. I take care of them every day." Claire gave her a sympathetic nod, but didn't back down. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, Mrs. Miller. I'll need to ask you a few questions to proceed with the investigation. It's standard procedure, but I assure you we take every report seriously." As Rachel stood there, the weight of the situation beginning to sink in, she felt a cold wave of realization wash over her. Karen had gone too far this time. Rachel was no stranger to conflict, but this was different. This was personal. Karen had weaponized her power as HOA president, using it to destroy Rachel's reputation and invade her family's private life. The morning that had started so peacefully had turned into a nightmare. Rachel wasn't going to let Karen ruin her family, not without a fight. The thought of what she would do next was already beginning to take shape in her mind. Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and Rachel was going to make sure she paid for it. ChatGPT said, "The air was thick with tension as Rachel sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the CPS worker, Claire, who sat across from her, clipboard in hand. The words Claire spoke seemed surreal, as though they couldn't possibly apply to her. Neglecting her children? It was a claim so far from the truth that Rachel almost laughed in disbelief. But Claire's stern expression and the official nature of her visit left no room for denial. "I understand this must be very confusing, Mrs. Miller," Claire said, her tone calm but firm. "But the report we received states that your children are often left unsupervised for long periods. It claims that they've been seen wandering around the neighborhood without adult supervision." Rachel felt her stomach drop. That's not true," she replied, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts to stay composed. "I'm home with my children every day. I take care of them. I don't leave them alone." Claire nodded, writing something down on her clipboard, but didn't seem convinced. "I understand, but we have to investigate every claim we receive, regardless of the circumstances." She looked up from her clipboard and met Rachel's eyes. "The report also mentions that your home is not properly maintained, that there are unclean areas, and your children have been seen in situations that could be considered unsafe." Rachel's heart pounded. "I clean every day. My kids are happy and healthy. They're not neglected, and my home is not filthy. I don't understand. Who would say these things about me?" The accusations were getting more outlandish with each passing moment. Claire flipped through the pages of her notes, then paused, looking back at Rachel. "It's not the first time we've received reports about your household, either. There have been previous complaints about your family's living conditions. These recent claims seem to be an extension of that." The words hit Rachel like a slap to the face. She hadn't thought of it at first, but now it was all too clear. Karen, the overbearing, controlling HOA president who had always made Rachel's life difficult, constantly nitpicking their lawn, their fence, their driveway, anything she could get her hands on. It was always about making sure her version of the neighborhood rules was followed, regardless of how petty or unreasonable they were. But now, Karen had gone too far. Rachel had suspected for a while that Karen might have some sort of personal vendetta against her. The HOA's constant demands, the nitpicking about the smallest things, it was all starting to make sense now. Karen was the one behind this. She had made a false report, manipulated the situation to her favor, and sent a social worker to her door, dragging her through a humiliating investigation. A wave of anger washed over Rachel. Karen had always been a thorn in her side, but now she had crossed the line. Rachel's thoughts began to sharpen with clarity. She wasn't going to let this stand. This wasn't just about a false accusation. This was about Karen using her position to destroy her family's reputation. Taking a deep breath, Rachel sat up straighter, her voice firm. "I'm not going to let this go. Karen is behind this, isn't she? I know it's her." Claire didn't respond immediately, but Rachel could see the shift in her eyes. She wasn't sure if Claire knew for certain, but she could sense the social worker's hesitation. "I'm going to fight this," Rachel continued, determination growing in her chest. "I won't let Karen ruin my life or my family's. I'm going to make sure she's held accountable." Claire scribbled a few more notes, her gaze softened by Rachel's resolve. "I understand," she said, "but remember, this is still an investigation. I have to follow protocol." Rachel nodded, but inside, she had already made up her mind. Karen had taken the first step in making this personal, but Rachel would be the one to finish it. She would use every ounce of her strength, every resource she had, to clear her name and expose Karen for the manipulative liar she was. The war had just begun, and Rachel was ready for the fight. The weight of the accusation hung heavy over Rachel as the days passed. What had started as a simple, almost absurd complaint had quickly snowballed into something much larger. Karen's reach had extended far beyond just the HOA, and now the entire neighborhood seemed to be involved. Rachel was used to handling pressure. She had worked in high-stakes environments before, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional toll this would take. The first few days after Claire's visit were a whirlwind of phone calls, follow-ups, and forced compliance. The CPS investigation had begun in earnest, and Rachel felt her world slowly slipping from her grasp. Karen had already taken steps to escalate things, contacting the school where Zoe and Ethan attended, requesting access to their records, and asking pointed questions about their home life. Teachers, whom Rachel had once trusted, were now being asked about their students' well-being, questioning if there were signs of neglect that no one had noticed before. Even the neighbors were being contacted for testimonials about Rachel's parenting and the state of her home. Every time Rachel spoke to a neighbor, she noticed a subtle change in their demeanor. The whispers behind closed doors, the glances exchanged when she passed by, people who had once waved and said hello were now avoiding her eyes. Rachel wasn't naive. She knew what was happening. Karen's influence had spread like wildfire, and now it seemed that everyone was judging her, unsure of what to believe. The once close-knit community had turned its back on her, and Rachel felt utterly alone in the battle ahead. Her house, which had always been her sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. The constant worry over the children's well-being, the never-ending phone calls, and the pressure from the investigation began to take a toll on her. Sophia, her close friend and confidant, tried to offer her support, but even she was beginning to feel the weight of Karen's manipulation. The doubts that Karen had sown were everywhere, seeping into Rachel's own mind, making her question her worth as a mother. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The silence was suffocating, and she could feel the weight of the walls closing in. Karen had won for now, but Rachel wasn't ready to give up. She needed to act, to fight back. But how? That's when she realized that she was more than just a stay-at-home mom. Rachel had worked hard to build a successful career in government, and she held a position of significant power. She was the state director for a major government agency. It wasn't something she talked about often. She had always kept her professional life separate from her family. But now, in this moment, it felt like the only weapon she had left. Taking a deep breath, Rachel pulled out her phone and dialed Sophia's number. She needed to talk to someone who would understand, someone who wouldn't question her resolve. Sophia picked up after the first ring. "Hey, what's going on?" Sophia's voice was warm, but Rachel could hear the concern in it. I'm the state director, Sophia," Rachel said, her voice almost trembling. "I never told you this before, but it's time to use my position. I'm going to make sure Karen pays for what she's done." Sophia was silent for a moment before she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I knew you had it in you, Rachel. This is what we need, your position, your power. Karen won't stand a chance once you start fighting back." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes as the weight of her decision settled in. It was time to stop being passive, time to stop letting Karen control her life. Rachel had power, real power, and it was time to use it. "I'm going to expose Karen for what she is," Rachel said, her voice steady. "I've got the resources, and I'm not stopping until this ends." And for the first time in days, Rachel felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone. She wasn't powerless. She was ready to fight, and this time Karen wouldn't win. Rachel sat in the quiet of her living room, the weight of everything that had transpired crashing down on her. The stress of the CPS investigation, the pressure of Karen's false accusations, and the betrayal she had felt from her own community had all begun to build to a breaking point. But as she stared at the papers in front of her, evidence of Karen's manipulative behavior, Rachel realized that she had something that could change everything. Something Karen had no idea about. For years, Rachel had kept her professional life separate from her personal life, but now it was time for the world to see her for who she really was. She wasn't just a stay-at-home mom. She was the state director for a major government agency. a position that gave her access to resources, connections, and power. Power that could crush Karen's carefully constructed facade in an instant. Rachel took a deep breath as she reached for her phone, dialing Sophia's number. The line clicked, and Sophia's warm voice came through immediately. "Hey, how are you holding up?" Rachel's lips curved into a slight smile at the sound of Sophia's voice, but there was no masking the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I'm holding up," Rachel said, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "But I've had enough of Karen." "I know. She's pushing everyone to their breaking point," Sophia replied sympathetically. "Have you heard anything new from the CPS investigation?" "Yeah, I've heard plenty," Rachel said, her jaw tightening. "But the real reason I called is it's time to stop playing by Karen's rules. I'm done being passive. I'm going to use what I've got to expose her for who she really is." Sophia was silent for a moment, clearly trying to process what Rachel had just said. "Wait, what are you talking about?" Rachel took a deep breath and then dropped the bombshell. "I'm not just a stay-at-home mom, Sophia. I'm the state director for a major government agency. I have the power to make things happen, and I'm going to use that power to turn the tables on Karen. I've kept it under wraps because I didn't want it to define me, but now I see it's the only thing that's going to stop her." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Rachel could practically hear the wheels turning in Sophia's mind. Finally, Sophia spoke, her voice full of admiration and resolve. "Rachel, that's incredible. But are you sure? You've kept this part of your life private for a reason, and going public with this could bring even more attention to Karen. It's a huge risk." "I know," Rachel replied, a determination in her voice. "But I've been passive long enough. Karen can't get away with this. She's been abusing her position for far too long. And now it's time to expose her." Sophia's voice softened. "You've got the power to do this, Rachel. And I'm with you every step of the way. But we need to be smart about this. We can't just jump in without a solid plan." "Exactly," Rachel agreed, standing up from the table. She walked to the window, gazing out at the quiet neighborhood. Karen had destroyed their peace, but that was about to change. "I've already started gathering evidence. Karen has a long history of targeting families, making false complaints, and using her position to manipulate the neighborhood. I'm going to use that against her." Sophia sounded reassured. "We'll make sure Karen doesn't get away with this. She's about to learn exactly who she's been messing with." As Rachel hung up the phone, a sense of clarity washed over her. She was no longer just fighting for her family. She was fighting for justice, for the truth to be revealed. The strategy was forming in her mind, and Karen's world was about to come crashing down. With her position as state director, Rachel had the tools she needed to expose Karen's abuse of power once and for all. Rachel knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. And this time, the battle wasn't just for her, it was for the entire neighborhood, for the families that had suffered under Karen's reign of terror. The days after Rachel had uncovered the truth about Karen's role in the CPS complaint were spent in a flurry of quiet but decisive action. Rachel was done being reactive. Now it was time to take control. With the power and influence of her position as the state director, Rachel had the means to launch a counterattack that Karen wouldn't see coming. The first step was gathering information. Rachel knew that Karen had been using her position as HOA president to manipulate the community and attack families she didn't like. But now, Rachel needed to prove it. She began reaching out to community leaders, colleagues in local government, and trusted neighbors, asking for discreet information on Karen. Rachel's contacts were numerous, thanks to her years of service, and she was careful to make sure her inquiries were worded just right. There was no need to raise suspicion, especially not from Karen. One evening, after the kids were tucked into bed, Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. She sifted through documents, emails, and photos she had collected over the past few days, each one a small piece of the puzzle that was Karen's pattern of behavior. What she found was both shocking and maddening. Karen had a long history of filing false complaints, not just against Rachel, but also against other families in the neighborhood. There were numerous incidents where Karen had targeted people over petty disputes, yard decorations, how often the grass was mowed, even how loud a child's laugh was. The complaints had never been legitimate, but they were always just enough to cause stress and discomfort in the lives of those Karen decided to go after. But it wasn't just about the complaints. Rachel also found records of Karen using her influence to manipulate the HOA board members, pushing through arbitrary rules and regulations that favored her own personal agenda. It was clear now Karen had been abusing her power for years, making her the de facto ruler of the neighborhood, hiding behind her position, and using it to control people she didn't like. With the weight of the evidence stacked in front of her, Rachel felt a surge of determination. Karen had crossed the line this time, and it was time for her to pay for the harm she had caused. The power Rachel held as the state director wasn't just a title, it was a weapon. She was going to use it to take Karen down. The next morning, Rachel gathered the necessary documents, carefully preparing a formal complaint to present to the HOA board and local authorities. She made sure to highlight Karen's history of abusing her position, as well as the false accusations Karen had leveled against her. Rachel wasn't just asking for Karen to be removed from the HOA, she was demanding that Karen be investigated for her actions and that the neighborhood take a long, hard look at the damage Karen had done. Before submitting the formal complaint, Rachel took one final step. She reached out to a few trusted government colleagues who had experience dealing with Karen's kind of manipulation. These were people who knew how to handle situations like this, people who could help push the investigation forward quickly and efficiently. They agreed to back her up, offering support and additional resources to ensure that Karen's actions were thoroughly scrutinized. When Rachel walked into the HOA meeting later that week, she knew she was ready. She had laid the groundwork for the investigation, and now it was time to put everything into motion. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors who had lived in the neighborhood for years. Karen was already at the front, clipboard in hand, her usual smug expression firmly in place. But when Rachel walked up to the podium, her presence commanded attention. "I have a complaint to file," Rachel began, her voice strong, unwavering. "And it's not about lawn care or fence height. This is about the abuse of power that has been going on in this community for far too long." She handed out copies of the complaint to each board member, detailing Karen's actions and the long list of false accusations Karen had made against families in the neighborhood. Rachel wasn't just going to stop at Karen's removal, she was going to make sure everyone knew exactly who they were dealing with. The tension in the room was palpable, and as Karen's face flushed with anger, Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. This was the turning point. Karen could no longer hide behind her position. The truth was out now, and Rachel was just getting started. The evening of the HOA meeting felt like a final showdown. Rachel had spent the past few days carefully organizing her thoughts, gathering her evidence, and ensuring she was fully prepared for the moment. She knew Karen would be ready to fight back, to deny everything and maintain her grip on the neighborhood. But Rachel wasn't worried. This was her moment to reclaim her life, to stand tall, and expose Karen for what she truly was, a manipulative bully who had been using her power to tear apart the community. Rachel arrived at the community center early, the weight of the evening ahead pressing on her shoulders. As she walked into the room, she could see Karen already at the front, seated with the HOA board members, wearing that same smug expression that Rachel had come to despise. The room was filled with familiar faces, neighbors who, for too long, had been too afraid to stand up against Karen. The tension in the air was palpable as Rachel took a deep breath and walked confidently toward the front of the room, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. "Good evening, everyone," Rachel began, her voice steady and commanding as she addressed the room. The chatter died down, and all eyes turned toward her. Karen looked up from her notes, her expression a mix of surprise and disdain. Rachel knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't just about confronting Karen, it was about showing everyone in the room the truth. "I'm sure you're all aware of the complaints I've made about Karen," Rachel continued, her eyes locking with Karen's. "But tonight, I'm here to show you why this isn't just personal, it's about accountability, transparency, and the abuse of power." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unprepared for Rachel's boldness. What is this about, Rachel? We're all just here to discuss neighborhood issues, not personal attacks, she said, her tone condescending. Rachel didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder filled with documents, photographs, and testimonies, evidence that had been collected over the past few weeks. It's not just personal, Karen, Rachel said, her voice cutting through the air. It's about your abuse of power. It's about the way you've used your position as HOA president to manipulate, harass, and intimidate the families in this neighborhood. Rachel set the folder down on the table in front of her, then turned to the board members, her gaze sweeping across the room. You all deserve to know the truth about what's been happening here. Karen has a long history of filing false complaints, not just against me, but against other families in this community, families who, like me, have been targeted simply because Karen didn't like the way they lived their lives. She flipped through the pages of the folder, pulling out a stack of documents and handing them to the board members. Here are the records of complaints filed by Karen, complaints about things as trivial as garden gnomes, the color of someone's front door, or how often a lawn was mowed. Karen has been using her position to create an atmosphere of fear in this neighborhood. And it ends now. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Rachel wasn't finished. And then there's the CPS report, the one Karen filed against me. A report that accused me of neglecting my children, completely false accusations made purely to punish me for standing up to her. This is not the first time she has used her power to destroy people's reputations, and it needs to stop. The room fell silent as Rachel's words sank in. The board members were looking at each other, murmuring among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable with what they were hearing. Karen shifted in her seat, clearly rattled, but she tried to maintain her composure. This is absurd, Karen snapped, her voice rising. You can't just come in here and accuse me of things without any proof. But Rachel was unyielding. I have all the proof I need, Karen. The evidence is right here in front of you. And you know what else? The entire community knows who you really are. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the way you've used your position to control and manipulate people. The community deserves better, and I'm going to make sure you're held accountable for everything you've done. Karen's face flushed with anger as she stood up. You think you can destroy me, don't you? I'll make sure you regret this, she spat. But Rachel remained calm, her eyes unwavering. I don't need to destroy you, Karen, Rachel said, her voice cool and controlled. You've already done that to yourself. The room was still, the weight of Rachel's words hanging in the air. Karen was no longer the untouchable figure she had once been. Rachel had turned the tables, and now the truth was out in the open. Karen had been unmasked, her actions laid bare for everyone to see. As Rachel left the meeting, she felt a sense of victory, a quiet satisfaction that she had not only fought for herself and her family, but had also exposed the truth for everyone else in the neighborhood. Karen's reign was over, and the community was finally free to move forward. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt confident that justice would prevail. The fallout from the confrontation was swift and undeniable. Within hours of the meeting, whispers had spread like wildfire throughout the neighborhood, and Karen's grip on the HOA began to crumble. Rachel had known this day would come, the moment when the truth would finally be revealed, but seeing it unfold in real time was still surreal. The first sign of change came when the HOA board convened a special meeting to discuss Karen's removal. Rachel had gathered the necessary evidence, and the board had no choice but to vote her out. Karen was officially stripped of her title as HOA president, the very position she had used to bully and manipulate everyone around her. It wasn't just her position that was taken from her, it was her credibility, her power, and the control she had so ruthlessly wielded over the neighborhood. The next day, Rachel stood at the kitchen counter, sipping her coffee, trying to absorb the magnitude of what had happened. The house was quiet, the kids still at school, and for the first time in weeks, Rachel could breathe without the constant worry looming over her. The accusations, the tension, the looming fear of losing everything, it was all behind her now. But the victory came with a deep sense of reflection. Outside the window, the neighborhood felt different. The same people who had once whispered behind her back, avoiding eye contact when she walked past, were now openly supportive. Rachel received texts and phone calls from neighbors offering their apologies, expressing their gratitude for her courage, and thanking her for standing up to Karen. Rachel couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in the air. There was a sense of relief that spread throughout the community. People no longer had to tiptoe around, no longer had to fear the overbearing presence of Karen. What was even more surprising was the public apology from some of the families Karen had previously targeted. Rachel knew that many of them had been too afraid to speak out before, but now that the truth was out, they felt empowered to join in, to make their voices heard. It was as if a dam had broken, and all at once, the community was standing together, united against the woman who had tried to tear it apart. For Rachel, it was both a victory and a quiet realization of the power of truth. She had fought not just for her family, but for every family that had been oppressed by Karen's reign of terror. The feeling of justice was sweet, but the weight of everything they had gone through wasn't easily forgotten. There was a quiet peace in knowing Karen could no longer manipulate their lives, but Rachel knew that this victory was just one battle in the larger war of reclaiming her own peace and her family's safety. As she sat back down at the kitchen table, Rachel thought about the long road ahead. The community was healing, and though Karen had been removed from her position, there would still be work to do. The tension that had once held them all captive was finally starting to loosen, but it had taken everything from Rachel, her strength, her courage, and the support of the people who loved her. The battle wasn't over. There were still legal matters to settle, and Karen wasn't the only one to blame. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel allowed herself to breathe, knowing that this chapter was over and the road to peace, true peace, had finally begun. The first week after Karen's removal felt like a breath of fresh air for Rachel and the neighborhood. The tension that had once hung in the air like a dark cloud was slowly dissipating. The oppressive atmosphere that had filled their home and the entire community had lifted, replaced by a sense of relief and renewal. It wasn't just the absence of Karen, it was the quiet power of people coming together, standing up for what was right, and realizing that they no longer had to live in fear of someone's petty control. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak out now found the courage to express themselves. The small, daily interactions that had been overshadowed by Karen's manipulation were now filled with openness and warmth. Rachel could see it clearly. Conversations in the front yard, casual chats by the mailbox, and even children playing together again, free of the underlying fear that had once pervaded every corner of their community. But it wasn't just the small, quiet moments of connection that stood out. It was the larger, more deliberate actions. Rachel had been determined from the beginning to make sure that the community didn't just return to the status quo. The damage Karen had done wasn't just about one person. It was about the culture of fear and control that had taken root under her reign. Rachel knew that to truly rebuild the community, they needed to do more than simply remove Karen. They needed to put in place systems that would ensure everyone had a voice and no one would ever again be subjected to Karen's abuse of power. So, Rachel began working with the HOA to create a new set of guidelines, ones that were fair, inclusive, and transparent. She collaborated with former board members who had been silenced by Karen's dominance, and together they crafted a proposal for a new leadership structure that would promote fairness and community involvement. They introduced regular meetings where neighbors could voice concerns, ask questions, and vote on decisions that affected everyone. No more arbitrary rules, no more fear of being singled out. Rachel wanted the HOA to be a space of mutual respect, not a dictatorship of one person's personal agenda. It wasn't easy, change rarely is, but the support from the community was overwhelming. Rachel knew that the people around her were ready for this change, ready to take back control of their neighborhood. Slowly, the new HOA structure began to take shape, with Rachel at the center, using her legal knowledge and position to guide the process. The more involved the community became, the more they began to take pride in their shared responsibility. What had once been a divided and fearful group was now coming together, stronger than ever. But the real turning point came when Rachel decided to host a community gathering, a celebration, a moment to bring everyone together and begin healing the wounds that had been left behind. The invitation was simple, but its impact was profound. Rachel knew this event wasn't just about food and music, it was about restoring trust, rebuilding connections, and moving forward as a united community. The day of the gathering, the park near the center of the neighborhood was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. Longtime neighbors who had barely exchanged a word now stood together, chatting and catching up. Families who had been too frightened to attend events in the past now played games, shared stories, and enjoyed the simple joy of being in each other's company without fear. Rachel stood at the front of the gathering, watching it all unfold, her heart swelling with pride. The transformation was nothing short of incredible. What had once been a community fractured by control and fear was now a place of unity and support. The work wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead, but Rachel could see the potential. They had taken the first step toward something better. As the sun began to set and the crowd began to disperse, Rachel felt a sense of peace settle over her. Karen may have tried to destroy their neighborhood, but what she didn't understand was that the community's strength had always been in its people. Rachel had just given them a chance to realize it. The healing had begun. The bonds that Karen had tried to break had only grown stronger, and Rachel was proud to have played a part in rebuilding what had been shattered. As she stood there, surrounded by the people who had once been divided, now united, Rachel knew they had achieved something important. The community was no longer just a place to live, it was a place where people truly belonged. And no one, not even Karen, could ever take that away again. The courtroom was quiet except for the occasional rustle of papers, but Rachel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This was it, the final step, the last move in the chess game she had been playing for months. She had already exposed Karen for what she was, a power-hungry manipulator, willing to use her influence to tear apart people's lives. But now, Rachel was going to make sure Karen faced the full weight of the law for everything she had done. Rachel had taken legal action against Karen for the false CPS report, the one that had accused her of neglecting her children and nearly destroyed her family. The impact of that accusation had been devastating, not just emotionally, but in terms of how it had affected Rachel's reputation and her standing in the community. But Rachel wasn't going to let Karen get away with it. Not this time. She had gathered the evidence, presented the case, and now it was time for Karen to answer for her actions. As Rachel sat in the courtroom, she knew the game had changed. No longer was Karen the untouchable HOA president, wielding her power with impunity. Now, Karen was just another defendant, facing consequences for the harm she had caused. The neighborhood, once fractured and silent under Karen's reign, was now united. Rachel had earned the support of her neighbors, who were now ready to speak out, to stand with her against the injustice Karen had inflicted upon them all. The judge called the court to order, and Rachel took the stand once more, her heart steady, her resolve unwavering. She recounted the series of events leading up to the CPS report, detailing how Karen had made false accusations against her, not just to Rachel, but to the entire community. She spoke about the damage that had been done, how Karen had used her position to manipulate others to control their lives, and to spread lies that threatened to tear apart everything Rachel had worked for. Karen, sitting across the room, looked almost defiant, but there was an edge to her posture now, a crack in her confidence. Rachel could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that she was no longer in control, no longer the queen of her own little kingdom. She had underestimated Rachel's resolve, and now it was too late. Karen took the stand in her defense, attempting to spin the situation, claiming that her concerns about Rachel were genuine. She tried to paint herself as the concerned neighbor, the person who was just trying to protect the children in the community. But Rachel was prepared. She had already gathered testimony from the social worker involved in the CPS investigation, from neighbors who had witnessed Karen's repeated overreach, and from the legal records showing Karen's history of filing false complaints. The final nail in the coffin came when Rachel presented evidence of Karen's past interactions with other families, documents showing a pattern of abuse, of using her HOA position to bully, intimidate, and punish people who dared to challenge her authority. The room was still as the judge reviewed the evidence. After what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. The court has reviewed all the evidence presented. Given the serious nature of the allegations and the clear abuse of power by the defendant, I find in favor of the plaintiff. Karen will be held accountable for the false accusations made against Rachel and the emotional distress caused by her actions. Rachel's heart swelled with relief, but there was no time to savor the moment. This wasn't just about her, it was about ensuring that Karen could never hurt anyone again. The judge ruled that Karen would not only face a civil lawsuit, but would also be barred from holding any official position within the HOA or any other community organization in the future. Karen was to pay restitution for the damage caused, and her actions would be publicly documented, ensuring that everyone knew what she had done. As the gavel came down, Rachel felt a deep sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by something else, a quiet pride. Karen had been given a chance to change, to be better, but she had chosen to wield power for her own benefit, regardless of the harm it caused. Rachel had fought back, and she had won. As Rachel left the courtroom, she was greeted by her neighbors, who now saw her as a hero. She had stood up not just for herself, but for all of them. They had rebuilt the community, and now, with Karen no longer a threat, it was time to rebuild their trust in each other. Rachel walked out into the sunlight, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Karen was no longer a threat, and now Rachel could finally move on, knowing she had done the right thing, not just for her family, but for everyone who had suffered under Karen's reign. The community was free once again. The days that followed the court ruling felt surreal, as if the world had finally returned to its natural rhythm. Rachel stood at the kitchen window one quiet morning, watching the sunlight stream across the yard, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed lawn. It had been a long road, full of obstacles and pain, but now the neighborhood seemed different, calmer, more at peace. The oppressive cloud that had hung over them for so long, all because of Karen, had finally lifted. Rachel could hardly believe how much had changed in such a short period. It felt like the tension that had once ruled the community was gone, replaced by something lighter, hope, perhaps, or even trust. The once division caused by Karen's abuse of power was slowly being healed by the open and honest communication Rachel had worked so hard to restore. It wasn't just about winning in court, it was about rebuilding what had been torn down, and that was something far more significant. The neighborhood had already begun to come together. People who had once whispered behind closed doors now smiled openly at Rachel and her family, offering words of encouragement and support. The same neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out against Karen now saw the truth, and many even publicly acknowledged Rachel's role in bringing about change. The children in the neighborhood played together without fear of retaliation, and families who had kept to themselves now hosted casual dinners, creating bonds that had been missing for years. Rachel's life, once filled with constant stress and worry, now felt like a new beginning. The relief she felt wasn't just about the court ruling or Karen's removal, it was about knowing that she had protected her family, not just from Karen, but from a fear that had kept them trapped. Rachel reflected on how much strength it had taken to push through the constant barrage of accusations, the loneliness of fighting alone, and the overwhelming desire to give up at times. But she hadn't. She had stood firm, not just for herself, but for every family that had been too scared to speak out. She thought back to the days when Karen's voice echoed in the neighborhood, when her manipulations had gone unchecked, when Rachel felt like there was no way out. And then she thought about the courage it had taken to confront Karen, to go head-to-head with a woman who had been used to controlling everything around her. Rachel had always known that doing what was right often required sacrifice, but this victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to every person who had ever been silenced by Karen's cruelty. Rachel had done more than protect her family. She had empowered an entire community to stand up and fight for their right to live in peace. Now, standing in the quiet of her home, Rachel allowed herself to take in the full weight of what they had achieved. The victory was more than legal, it was personal. She had been tested, pushed to her limits, and had emerged stronger, not just as a mother and partner, but as someone who had found her voice in the midst of fear and doubt. Rachel had realized that true power wasn't just about fighting back. It was about finding the courage to stand for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against you. The soft laughter of her children in the other room brought Rachel back to the present. She could hear Zoe and Ethan playing, their giggles a stark contrast to the tension that used to fill their home. They had endured too much, but now they were free to be themselves, to grow, to thrive, without fear or manipulation clouding their world. And for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt at peace. The victory was not just about Karen, but about creating a future where her children could grow up in a world of fairness and equality, where they could see firsthand the power of standing up for what was right. As Rachel sat down to join her family, she took a moment to savor the peace they had fought so hard to find. The future was brighter now, not because of what they had won, but because they had learned the value of courage, unity, and the strength of a community that would no longer be divided. Rachel knew that they had made a difference, and that, in the end, was the truest victory of all. If Rachel's journey has inspired you, remember that standing up for what's right can change lives, even entire communities. Don't let fear or intimidation hold you back. Whether it's for your family, your neighborhood, or yourself, your voice matters. Share this story and empower others to speak up against injustice. Like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and change. Together, we can create the future we deserve, one where courage and unity make all the difference.